Okay, it is 1 p.m. Eastern, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Mark Cancelari, and today's webinar is titled Climate Adaptation Strategies for Longleaf Pine Ecosystems. And we're excited to have Joshua Puhlick, PhD silviculturist, with the Jones Center at Ichauway, Georgia, with us today. We'll be introducing Joshua in just a few moments, but first I'd like to remind you of a few logistical details. So again, thank you for tuning in today to the Climate Adaptation for Forest-Dependent Wildlife webinar series. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Ecology Working Group, Science Applications, and Migratory Birds programs, the National Conservation Training Center, are joining the USDA Forest Service and Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science in sponsoring this webinar series. CEU credits are available for the series. Please contact Jim Siegel if you would like credit using the email address on the screen, and we'll also add that email address to the chat here in a few moments. First, as a disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. This webinar is being recorded live and all participants have been muted, and it will remain that way for the duration of the webinar, but we do want you to participate. So please, at any time during the webinar, post questions into the chat. So to submit a question, first click the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, then simply type your question in the chat box and press enter. Please make sure your questions are being addressed to everyone in the drop-down menu of the chat box. Please feel free to enter questions at any point during the presentation, and we'll even pause to take questions halfway through. If you wish to change your presentation view, you can access different view modes in the upper right-hand corner of your screen as shown on this slide. We do have a few different presenters to start us off, so the gallery mode might be the best way to go. I'm now going to turn you over to Stephen Handler to tell us a little bit more about this series, as well as introduce our wonderful speaker for today. All right, Stephen, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. Can you advance to the next slide? Great. So hopefully many of you are repeat customers by this point in our webinar series. And so you've seen the trajectory of the story we've been telling. This 12-part webinar series tells a story about climate change and its impacts on forest ecosystems, and particularly on forest-dependent wildlife species. We've been examining forest ecosystems from around the country, their composition, their structure under a changing climate, and how those changing factors influence wildlife populations and carbon dynamics. We've been sharing tools and management approaches to help facilitate forest and wildlife climate adaptation at both landscape and stand scales. And I'm excited for our next installment here in this series, Josh Puhlick. Next slide, please. So hopefully this is the webinar you all signed up for today. You're here to hear Josh talk about adaptation strategies for longleaf pine ecosystems. Next slide. And just quickly about Josh, so you know a little bit about his background. You can see it on the screen here, but he is a silviculturist for the Jones Center. Josh will tell us a little more about the Jones Center for folks who aren't familiar. And he's interested in developing silvicultural strategies for enhancing carbon accumulation in forests as a contribution to mitigating climate change. He also serves as a site co-lead for the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change experiment at the Jones Center, and he's going to tell us more about that experiment. So I forgot to introduce myself. I work for the Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science up in Houghton, Michigan. We're one of the partners bringing you this webinar series. I'm going to be just moderating, handling questions that come in the chat today. So I'll take my first opportunity to encourage you all to please enter questions into the chat box as they occur to you. I'll be sorting those and looking for questions that seem apt. Josh will break in the middle of the presentation for a quick Q&A, and then we'll save a lot of time for questions and discussion at the end. So please keep the questions coming throughout the webinar. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Josh. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Stephen, and thanks for moderating this session. And thank you to all who have helped make this happen. I especially thank Jeff and Jim for inviting me to present today. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide an in-depth overview of the forest management that we do here at the Jones Center at Ichauway. And then about halfway through the presentation, I'm going to discuss in detail the strategies that we're using to adapt forests to climate change here at the Jones Center. So my intent today is to give you some examples of the things that we're doing here and that you could potentially apply to places where you work. Also, just to see some of the lessons that we've learned since we've initiated treatments at the center. And I'm just gonna figure out how to advance my slides here because that's not working. Okay, there we go. All right, so Ichauway, it's located, as Stephen said, in Southwest Georgia, and it's just under 30,000 acres, and parts of the property, they border the Flint River, which is shown here in this photo. And the property was established as a quail hunting reserve in the 1920s by Mr. Robert W. Woodruff. And he was the longtime chairman of the Coca-Cola Company. After his death in 1985, the foundation established the center, and that occurred in 1991. Currently, we have 7 scientists here at the Jones Center, and our core programs, they're woods, water, and wildlife. Since I'm going to be talking about longleaf pine, I put up this map of the historical distribution of longleaf pine, which extended from southern Virginia to eastern Texas. Prior to European settlement, longleaf pine ecosystems occupied about 92 million acres. And cutover areas of longleaf pine were often replaced by loblolly and slash pine plantations. FIA data through this month indicate that longleaf pine and longleaf pine in mixture with oak occupy about 5.6 million acres of forest land, with about 62% of that area in naturally regenerated stands. And there's many ways that longleaf pine ecosystems are classified based on factors like vegetation, soils, and topography. I think of longleaf pine as being part of large tracts of land that are widely dispersed across the southern United States. For example, This photo is of Ordway Swisher Biological Station. It's located near Gainesville, Florida, and it has many natural community types. This happens to be an upland community dominated by longleaf pine and turkey oak. These soils are relatively poor quality, and I find that, you know, every tract of longleaf pine is different. I visited places like the Austin Carry Forest in Florida and the Scambia Experimental Forest in southern Alabama. They're all a little bit different, and that influences the development of our silvicultural prescriptions. I mostly work in upland and sandridge communities at Ichauway. The stand shown here is it's a very productive site. You see that lush wiregrass community, which is characteristic of soils that were never tilled, or at least weren't tilled in the recent past. Here we manage our forests mostly with single tree selection and prescribed fire. However, there are a lot of longleaf pine plantations intermixed with our natural stands and fields. Some of these fields have row crops. The one here has goldenrod and ragweed. As I mentioned, the property was established as a quail plantation, and that mixture of different land uses is important for quail management. You know, you see all those hedgerows and features like that. Most of the longleaf pine plantations that I conduct research in were planted in the 1980s and 1990s, and most have been commercially thinned at least once. Here at Ichauway, we're working on transitioning these plantations to something that resembles more of our naturally regenerated stands. So multiple cohorts of longleaf pine. We're also doing native ground cover restoration in these plantations, which a lot of them were planted on marginal ag lands, so initially had old field vegetation. Another important thing to remember is that southern quail plantations, many of them were established on cutover forest land. So the forests we see now developed from scattered residual trees that were left at that time. And over time, foresters who managed these stands built out multiple cohorts of longleaf pine using single tree selection. And a lot of that was based on the methods using the Stoddard-Neal approach. And there's a lot to that, but the main point is that we manage our stands. They have an irregular diameter distribution. So unlike what you may expect using methods like the BDEQ method, our stands have that more irregular size distribution, and we maintain more large trees with characteristics that are preferred by numerous wildlife species. We also use prescribed fire as a silvicultural tool. Talk a little bit about the pre-European fire regimes. They were dominated by growing season fires, so May, June, and July. And they occurred every 2 to 10 years, depending on local site conditions. As part of our prescribed fire program at Ichauway, we use fire on a 2-year fire return interval. And that prescribed fire is really important for limiting hardwood recruitment to mid-story canopy positions. We want to maintain that open pine system that we have here. And prescribed fire also helps to maintain plant and animal biodiversity. A really influential paper about the wildlife species here and their preferred habitat was led by Kevin McIntyre, who was our education coordinator, and Mike Connor and Laura Smith were were also part of this. They are scientists in the wildlife program. And they used empirical data on habitat occupancy associated with our network of forest monitoring plots. And these are some of the open pine specialists and indicator species that they focused on. And what they did is they produced figures like this for each species and species group, showing a range of values for pine basal area, herbaceous cover, canopy cover, shrub cover, and metrics like that. So Stephen is going to provide the link to some of these papers in the chat box. So if you're interested in that, you can refer to those links. And the important thing I wanted to mention here is these guidelines, they really help us drive our forest management here. And I also use these when I think about other objectives, such as carbon management. Another recent paper that was put out was on prescribed burning here at Ichauway. Stephen will also provide the link to that. Mike Connor and Laura Smith summarized a lot of the wildlife studies that were related to prescribed fire. For instance, they found that the Florida pine snake and eastern diamondback, eastern couchwhip, those species, they preferred these recently burned areas for basking. Also the edge created by the fire help them locate their prey, such as cotton rats and other small mammals. Interestingly, you know, the fire, prescribed fire, also influences a lot of the peaks and declines in the small mammal populations as well. They also found that open pine specialists were often absent on areas of the property where fire was excluded. And really, once you have this hardwood recruitment and you start to see a decline in the ground cover vegetation, this is when a lot of generalist species begin to take a foothold in these areas. And then finally, with some of these wildlife studies, they also found that the high nutritional content and the regrowth of vegetation after fire was important for white-tailed deer. They also found that about 1 to 3 years after fire, once these plants begin to develop, they provide cover for fawning areas and potentially reduce predation by predators such as coyotes. So this unique wildlife habitat and biodiversity that we have here at the Jones Center is really fueled by the management that we've done over time, according to the concepts of ecological forestry. We're, as part of our ecological forestry program, we have demonstrations where we've implemented group selection with reserves, and single tree selection. And the Jones Center was, one of several locations where these concepts were applied decades ago. And throughout my career, I've been fortunate to learn under Bob Seymour and Mac Hunter the roles that ecological forestry can have. And then going to Northern Arizona, learning about and seeing ecological restoration applied was very valuable throughout my career. And while I was at NAU, I began to see people think more about the role of climate and how that may influence some of our silvicultural prescriptions and the way we think about managing our forests. I really like this quote from Linda Nagel in the Journal of Forestry. Her and her authors say, given the inherent uncertainty in climate change impacts across temporal and spatial scales, natural range of variability may still hold some merit in informing, but not directing silvicultural prescriptions. So, not that we should abandon the concepts of ecological forestry and ecological restoration, but many managers begin to realize that we do have to anticipate the impacts of climate change and account for that in our prescriptions. So with that, we're going to take a short break and I'll answer, probably about 2 questions or so, and then we'll move into talking about the adaptive silviculture for climate change network and the work we do here as part of that network.
This is great. Thanks for helping us set the scene, Josh, and learn about the Jones Center. So we do have a couple early questions in the chat. That's great. I think these questions will also help paint the picture of the Jones Center. So first one I'll ask you, Josh. Does the Jones Center contain old growth longleaf pine or hardwood old growth in non-longleaf areas?
Yeah, so most of the Jones Center is secondary forests. We also have, like I said, a lot of longleaf pine plantations, and plantations of other species do occur on the property. There are tracts of what is considered old growth longleaf pine near the Jones Center in Thomasville, Georgia. We have tracts of old growth where we will usually bring people to see those conditions. But here at the Jones Center, primarily secondary forests.
Okay, and if you'll humor 1 or 2 more.
Yep.
Is there a benefit to having hardwood stands interspersed with open pine lands to maximize a habitat mosaic and biodiversity?
Yeah, definitely. We do have the hardwood forest types. We have a lot like riparian forest habitat. We have isolated depressional wetlands across the property. So there is more than just longleaf pine. But the communities where I do most of my research and that I'm involved with some of the management decisions are the upland pine communities. And, it's important there to limit the hardwood recruitment that we have just to keep that open pine structure. But hardwoods, they do occur within these stands. So a lot of them are just not solely longleaf pine. Many oak species do occur within these stands. So, yeah.
I'm going to ask one more general question.
Okay.
Then we're starting to get some more specific kind of forest management questions that I'm going to save. But please, folks in the audience, keep those technical questions coming. So, Josh, one more general question for you. What impact do feral pigs have on longleaf pinelands?
Yeah, so they can be quite a management challenge. The impact that they do have is that they can disrupt a lot of the native ground cover component. And, we do have a lot of threatened and endangered plant species on the property, which, the feral hog populations are a concern to us. So they can be very disruptive in that way. And yeah, they're becoming more of an issue here at Ichauway, but definitely something that we focus on at the center here with our research. So we have scientists who are involved with the impacts of feral hogs in the South. Yeah.
All right, I think that's probably a good set of starter questions. Josh, why don't you keep rolling, and then we'll keep picking up questions as we go.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for those questions, and move into the second part of the talk here. And I want to shift into adaptation approaches that we use here at the Jones Center. So we're part of the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change, or ASK network. The network was formed to test ecosystem-specific adaptation treatments across a gradient of adaptive approaches. And Ichauway was one of 5 of the original ASK sites, and Stephen Brantley and I are the co-leads for this site at Ichauway. And here I took a figure from Linda Nagel's paper. This here shows the different adaptation options along a continuum of management goals related to desired change in ecosystem attributes and mechanisms for coping with climate change. So on that vertical axis you see desired change, and on that horizontal gradient, how you're going to respond to that change. And I'll go over each of these adaptive options. We have resistance. I think of this as you're sort of fighting climate change, and your actions are aimed at maintaining relatively unchanged forest conditions. Resilience, here you're promoting actions that enable the system to bounce back after disturbance. And then transition, actions that accommodate change and allow ecosystems to respond to changing and new conditions. With the transition treatment, here's where you hear a lot of work with assisted migration. So planting tree species from more southerly latitudes, for example, at your research site. But as Tony D'Amato pointed out in one of our previous webinars, there's a lot more to it. Managers are starting to think about how do we successfully transition the species over time. So what type of shade tolerance should we be thinking about? Certain gap sizes that benefit those tree species that we're planting. What actions can we do to help those species be successful over time? So a lot of good work is being done on expanding how we think about transition. And each site, when they become part of the network, they go through a process of a planning process here, and they're doing things like using the climate change response framework and adaptation resources workbook to think about questions like the ones I posed here. So what are the climate trends and projections for the site, and what impacts and vulnerabilities are specific to the region? Things that we've identified here, we need to mitigate moisture stress and heat impacts. And we're beginning to see more intermittent drought conditions with any given year. And we also recognize that we're seeing more frequent and intense storm events. So those are in the form of hurricanes. Also this time of year, so December, January, and February, we have more tornadoes. I think that's becoming more of a trend in the South here, a weather pattern that I've recognized since being here for a short period of time. And I want to go over another part of the process here is the development of site-specific silvicultural prescriptions, but also thinking about what your desired future conditions are and your tactics for achieving them. So I'm going to talk about that in the context of the resilience treatment. This is what that treatment looks like. So we have 4 replicate stands of the resilience treatment across our property. And some of the desired future conditions that we would like to see are climate adapted species such as longleaf pine and xeric oaks, a range of tree sizes, so large trees and young cohorts of pine. We'd like to see a diverse understory of warm season grasses and the ability to maintain frequent low intensity fire and stand conditions that promote high water yields. Just to review some of our objectives for the resilience treatment, that overstory tree diversity is important. We want to grow trees that have high timber value, that yield harvested wood products that store carbon for long periods of time. Maintaining that hard mass component from some of those xeric oaks, red cockaded woodpecker and quail habitat are also important. And then reducing the risk of mortality from drought and wildfire. And again, increasing water yields. So the quantity of water is very important here in Southwest Georgia and throughout the region. So one way we can do that is reducing tree densities with the resilience treatment. Our specific tactics are to cut loblolly pine, which can occur in some of these stands. Also water oak, laurel oak, and live oak. Those are more music oaks. And with some of the large, especially live oaks, we also have to girdle and herbicide those. Smaller trees we can cut and then use herbicide to control sprouting. We also will use herbicide as needed to achieve our desired ground cover. Other tactics are, mastication to control that hardwood component as well. And then we have flexibility in our fire return interval within these stands. And we usually time that with good cone crops if we're interested in regenerating more cohorts of pine within these stands. Just to go over when some of our management activities were implemented. So in the winter of 2017 and 2018, that's when we implemented our treatments at Ichauway. Important thing to remember is that Hurricane Michael impacted Ichauway in October of 2018. So that has some implications. And then we've also put prescribed fire through the stands during the dormant season. So typically around the month of March in 2019, 2021, and 2023. And recently we followed up with herbicide treatment of some of those larger live oaks, which ended up resprouting on us. So I guess for folks who are doing this sort of thing, one lesson we learned was just to monitor some of those larger live oaks if one of your objectives is to reduce those in the stand. I'll just fast forward to a picture of one of those larger live oaks, and this is after girdling and hack and squirt of herbicide application. Here's a photo of some of the xeric oak components. So this is sandpost oak. We also have southern red oak and blue jack oak. Other xeric oaks like that are the species that we also retain in the resilience treatment with longleaf pine. Something that I'm beginning to implement in the resilience treatment is pre-commercial thinning of dense patches of pine saplings. So we're doing that to enhance structure in these stands to increase recruitment of longleaf pine to the mid-sized diameter class. So we think that that is important. We're not doing this for the entire stand, though. We are leaving some patches of pine untreated. So other ask sites have done something similar. So in the Great Lakes states with red pine with their resilience treatment, I know that they have what's called skip patches and other ones where they'll treat. So here at the Jones Center, we're pre-commercially thinning, maybe about half the patches that where we have research demonstration plots within the stand. So again, some of the objectives there are to reduce vulnerability to drought, improve the ability to see through the stand and enhance structure. Being able to see through the stand is more aligned with our some of our quail objectives. Also within those patches of pine, we're also monitoring soil moisture and temperature, where we do pre-commercial thinning and where we don't. And then we're also monitoring insect diversity and abundance. So one of the things I did here with Kier Klepsik's lab, his entomology lab, was go through and take cross sections from trees within these different adaptation approaches. And we're beginning to look at insect diversity and abundance across these different treatments. So I think that's really important for guiding the silvicultural prescriptions that are developed at these ask sites. We need to think about future insect outbreaks, for instance. So that may play into how you formulate your silvicultural prescriptions. Some lessons that we've learned through doing this. This is our transition treatment. And our target basal area you see here, 30 square feet per acre and only about 5 square feet per acre of xeric oaks. That reduced the tree densities quite a bit within the transition treatment. And then when Hurricane Michael happened, we had a lot of tree damage, tree mortality. So one of the things that we are concerned about is pine recruitment now within these stands. Some of the things that we're doing is planning late summer prescribed burn so we can expose mineral soil and time that with a good pine seed crop in the fall, try to establish more cohorts of longleaf pine in these stands now. So, even though these treatments were implemented way back in 2017, 2018, it's a continual process of implementing silvicultural treatments. According to that, you're staying within that framework and within the scope of those different treatments, but it's a continual process. So last year we hosted a carbon and longleaf pine workshop here at the Jones Center. We released a perspectives paper in forest ecology and management. That was a product that came out of that workshop, really highlighting some of the challenges we have here when thinking about carbon management. We have these open pine systems, trying to balance those carbon objectives with, as I mentioned, wildlife habitat, and now adapting forests to change, forests to future change as well. One of the things we're going to do, we monitor conditions within these different ask treatments, and we're going to project carbon stocks and other ecosystem services, take a look at those over time. During my career, we've done this when I was at the University of Maine here I show mixed species stands dominated by northern conifers. This is selection cutting. And what we did was we used empirical data. We had about 50 to 60 years of data from the Penobscot experimental forest, and then projected forest growth and mortality over time as well to compute carbon stocks. And here I show the cumulative sum of net changes in carbon stocks. This is a good way to visually take a look at change in carbon over time by different carbon pools, live trees, deadwood, and products. We see here that when you combine those three pools, selection cutting on a 20-year cycle, for example, this was a carbon sink. So when you think about those pools that I just mentioned. We also did something similar for the Maine adaptive silviculture network. Here I show an improvement cut. Here we were thinking about maintaining species that were predicted to do well under climate change. So we were considering some adaptive actions with this approach here. And in Maine, some folks are thinking on a 20 to 30 year time frame, thinking about how forest management will influence carbon dynamics over the short term. So when we project these stocks out over time, we see that improvement cut was a carbon, resulted in being a carbon sink. So, a good form of management, and I'm glad that we got to implement that there in Maine. So doing similar projections is something that we're going to be doing here with our different treatments in the ASK network. I also like to highlight that, we also need to be thinking about below ground carbon. And here at Ichauway, we're doing follow-up sampling of soil carbon, taking a look at soil carbon and soil nutrient stocks within our plantations and our natural stands. This is my research associate, Scott Taylor, collecting some samples. And we're working with some folks from UGA to look at change in soil carbon over time. So another important area to focus on. So in summary, before I take questions, I just hope that throughout this presentation, maybe learned a little bit more about the ecological forestry concepts that we apply here, some of the ecological restoration we're doing. Again, mentioning the plantations, trying to convert those to a more natural state and use native ground cover. And then moving into thinking about adaptation approaches and how we've implemented those here, the lessons we've learned, and then thinking about carbon management in these ecosystems. How do we do that while balancing other ecosystem objectives? And with that, I guess we've got a lot of time for questions, so we'll open it to questions here.
Thanks a lot, Josh.
Yeah.
You handled your time really well, and you built that story really nicely and gradually. So folks have a lot of good questions in the chat. I've been organizing them a little bit into topics, so we'll try to move through them by theme. And please, folks, continue to put your questions in the chat box. So we'll start with one more general question about longleaf pine. Is longleaf pine genetically diverse across its range?
Yeah, it is, and that's important to think about. My research hasn't gotten too much into the genetic and the things, but that is something that's important to think about with ecological restoration and adapting forests to change. We also think about that with our native ground cover restoration. Researchers here have found that using local seed sources is important when we do a lot of that restoration. And I would assume the same is true for longleaf pine seeds. So in our longleaf pine plantations, one of the questions I asked when I came here, what was that stock? Bare rooted, containerized, where did a lot of those trees come from? So a lot of that is unknown. It's more known for other southern pine species, but there are some folks working on genetics with longleaf pine, and I think that's going to influence heavily in the future about stock that we use when we're going to be doing new plantings or establishing new plantations of longleaf pine. So yeah, genetics is very important to think about in these ecosystems.
Okay, now we have 3 questions that are all kind of about fire. So I'll start with a more general one and then get to some specifics. In general, how do prescribed fires impact the spread of invasive species?
Yeah, I would say that invasive species are so something I think is just the nature of our property, something we think about, but is probably not as much of an issue as on other properties. So I would have to think more about that question. I know that, most of our challenges with prescribed fire, that we're thinking about have to, relate to the changing climate that we have. Are we going to have, shortened burn windows, conditions where we can implement prescribed fire? And then, do we use other silvicultural tools to supplement prescribed fire in the future? I know a lot of folks are thinking about strategies there and how they may do that. So our primary challenges here at the Jones Center, I think going forward in time, are going to be, how often can we implement the different burns that we do during the season, and how is that going to change under future climate conditions?
We had a question almost exactly on those lines. I'll go ahead and ask it. So if the Southeast US is forecast to have drier climate under modeled scenarios, do you anticipate backing off the prescribed fire frequency? Like using other methods or just doing it less frequently?
Yeah, I think you're just going to have to stay on top of it with your burn program. Make sure you take advantage of good conditions when you have them. Some, novel approaches to maybe supplementing the use of prescribed fire, maybe to do things like targeted browsing or grazing with domesticated livestock. That could be a novel way of how to deal with changing fire conditions over time, changing climate. In some areas where we have to try to get fire back in, mastication with machinery of that hardwood component is also used. That's a technique that we use here. And then once we can control the hardwoods, then get prescribed fire back in there. So those are maybe some different strategies I know a lot of people are thinking about. Yeah.
And then my last fire question right now is, are neighbors and local communities supportive of prescribed fire, or has there been pushback to using prescribed fire on the property?
Yeah, I think here in Georgia, I mean, we have the Georgia Prescribed Fire Council, and I think those folks do a good job of informing the community about the use of prescribed fire. I think there's a lot of acceptance of it here, and you know, they do a good job of educating landowners who are using prescribed fire. So I think that's important, and you know, Georgia and surrounding states are, I think, a model for the rest of the nation of how to, you know, create that public acceptance of the use of prescribed fire. You know, of course, you've got to do things like, you know, have smoke management programs in line and things like that. But you know, here, you know, I think just because we have that strong network, and there's been a lot of good work by Mark Melvin and others here at the Jones Center to push some of those initiatives forward.
Okay, thanks. Now we'll move to a block of 3 questions about more kind of forest management and silviculture.
Okay.
So you mentioned return interval for fires, but somebody had a question: what is the return interval for single tree selection or group selection in these forests?
Yeah, good question. So our return intervals here at Ichauway for single tree selection, they could be quite long, like up to 30 years. Here, making money off of timber is not a primary objective. It's one of our objectives, but there are many more that are more important. So, you know, our return interval is more flexible of when we enter the stands. We have the ability to time that with good market conditions as well. With some of the group selection and group selection with reserve, we're approaching about 15 years where we would have to make a second entry into those stands. And I think we're about there, so maybe 15 to 20 years. And some of the things we're considering there is the amount of regeneration that we do have within openings that were created during those first entries, and that'll inform where we expand gaps or we create new gaps within those stands. So there's a lot of active research. I think we still have a few years to gather data on that before we make a decision about our second entries into those stands. But I would say that's probably a common time frame for group selection in Longleaf Pine.
Thanks. So one person asked, single tree selection and group selection are not the type of prescription that we typically apply in the field. So if you're experimenting with these methods, how can your results inform our work?
Yeah, I would say there is a lot of literature on even-aged approaches in longleaf pine. A lot of that has come out of work done at the Escambia Experimental Forest by the U.S. Forest Service. So they have good documentation of shelterwood methods that are initiated in longleaf pine and seed tree methods. So silvicultural systems like that. We do have a lot of knowledge about that. Some of these adaptive approaches are a little different, and we're hoping to just inform folks about the use of those as well.
Okay, let's move on to A couple of minutes of climate change questions.
Okay.
Are you seeing any change in the success of your natural regeneration strategies? Or do you expect climate impacts on regeneration in the future?
Yeah. Let's see. One of the, I guess in response to that question too, we're doing a lot of monitoring, not only of our longleaf pine recruitment, but for example, with the transition approach, planting turkey oak within those stands, that's another species that we'll be monitoring over time, the success of other species besides longleaf pine. I would say, right now, from what I've noticed, an important thing that we evaluate here is the longleaf pine cone crop. And again, like I said, trying to time that with late summer burns as well. I think longleaf pine is in a climate adapted species. It can handle drought a bit better than other species in the South. So I think that's going to be an advantage for longleaf pine moving forward. But we'll be monitoring that over time. Yeah.
We had a question related to that. Do you see a possible point in the future where climate conditions have shifted enough that keeping longleaf pine is more like a resistance strategy?
Yeah, and I think that's where maybe the resilience approach and some of the things we're doing with the transition are important, and maintaining species diversity within those stands, because we are unsure about the outcomes that some species will have. So I think maintaining that species diversity for species that we anticipate to be better adapted to future climate change is important. But like I said, the trends that are projected for longleaf pine seem to be a lot more positive than for other species. So I wouldn't anticipate that longleaf pine would be poorer than for other species.
Okay, maybe a question that gets to your transition treatment. How do you balance sourcing seeds from local provenance against sourcing seeds from areas that might have conditions similar to what climate models will predict in the future? So are you doing any of that, importing new seed sourcing, seed sources of the same species in this experiment?
We aren't actively doing that in this experiment, but that would be, something to consider. I know that in the distant past, there was common garden studies with longleaf pine, but I don't believe there's been a lot of follow through with some of that for longleaf pine. We've had, I think, better success with a lot of our native plant communities and thinking about things like that. But yeah, definitely an important point, and yeah, something that should be a future research priority for longleaf pine.
Okay, and we're just running out the clock here. One more climate change question. How are you planning to increase tree resilience to the projected increase in frequency and intensity of strong storms?
Yeah, so that's something that some of the scientists here have been tracking, and one thing that we've noted in our adaptive approaches is that some of our xeric oaks were damaged and had a higher level of mortality than other species when we had these intense wind events here at the Jones Center. So that's something to think about, is that, you know, a lot of our treatments have been geared towards thinking about drought, but there's also the element of wind that you also need to think about. So there's a lot of trade-offs when formulating these silvicultural prescriptions, but you know, thinking about on the landscape where longleaf pine may be more prone to wind throw or wind damage is something to consider in your planning across properties. And then, yeah, like I said, thinking about the species mixture could be important as well. You know.
Okay, well, thank you, Josh. Let's give everyone give Josh a virtual round of applause. Thank you to our interpreters working hard there in the background on the side of all of our screens. Thank you to all of you for staying attentive and asking really good questions throughout. I have just a few questions that have come in that we don't have time for right now. I'll send Josh an email with those. If Josh is willing to provide any short summaries, we can send those back out to the participants.
Yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions. So Stephen can provide my email. I think he may have provided the link to our website at the center here in my web page, but I'd be happy to answer any questions or provide any documents that people need. So thanks a lot again for attending the webinar here.